Where did I put my notes? Don't want to spoil this book, not like last time. Oh, here we go. This video contains spoilers for The Fault in Our Stars and Looking for Alaska. If you haven't read these books and don't wish to be spoiled, please click away now. Otherwise, enjoy the video. I came up with a criticism for John Green. He's the most formulaic author I've ever read. Numerous tropes and motifs just keep turning up in his books over and over again. This might have something to do with the fact that every single book he's ever written is a teen romance drama from the point of view of a heterosexual male every nerd in his late teens whose main arc mainly consists of chasing a girl he's interested in while having to come to terms with the banality of existence or some such nonsense. And I'm not trying to suggest that a story premise like this might be confining, but using it multiple times in conjunction with the same writing style and the same basic story structure starts to make it seem like your range as an author is severely limited. Let me just clarify that I don't think John Green's books are bad. You already know that I liked Looking for Alaska, and his subsequent books are still good, I suppose. I typically have low expectations for teen romance dramas, understandably so, but John Green's first outing thwarted my expectations by performing the small feat of being unique and intelligent, two qualities which are severely lacking in its genre counterparts. 4 more books later, his writing style is more refined and his story structure is stronger, but the uniqueness is considerably less unique and the intelligence seems lacking somehow. So here we are, The Fault in Our Stars, John Green's magnum opus, supposedly. Yet again we step into the shoes of a male every nerd pining over a girl. What's his name this time? Hazel Grace Lancaster? That doesn't sound like a... Right, well let's follow Hazel to high school and see what anarchic antics she can get up to... What? She's not in high school? She is a teenager, right? What's the deal with her being a teenager outside of school? Is she sick or something? Well then, pardon me while I eat my words. So for those of you unaware, The Fault in Our Stars is the story of a 16-year-old girl who is most likely going to die an early death of lung cancer. She's on the brink of death, but fortunately a miracle drug buys her a few more years. Nevertheless, she's just in the middle of contemplating that her short and uneventful life is going to go completely to waste when a boy named Augustus Waters wanders into her life, whisks her off her feet, and they partake in the kind of sentimental romance tale which ironically was a point of satire in The Bad Girl, complete with non-descriptive sex scene. Well, they are aged 16 and 17 respectively. Obviously you're not going to get details. I mean, this is John Green, not Tommy Oliver. The Fault in Our Stars wears its subtext on its sleeve. In fact, you can accurately determine the central theme of the entire story just by reading the title. Even if you aren't as intricately familiar with Shakespeare as you'd need to be to get this reference, don't worry, because around the third way mark the novel itself provides you the quote. From the play Julius Caesar, the quotation goes, "The fault, dear Brutus, is not in our stars, but in ourselves." The stars obviously refer to destiny, the same line of thinking that leads us to lines like "when the stars align," being used to designate particular circumstances otherwise out of control of the subject. Shakespeare has Cassius posit that poor scenarios have nothing to do with the grand machinations of the universe but are entirely dependent on the responsibility of the individual in question. As in, you have a shitty lot because of your choices, not because of the proverbial hand you were dealt by destiny. John Green begs to differ to this line of thinking and has the entirety of the main cast of teenagers be kids who got dealt a shitty proverbial hand. Hazel got dealt a shitty pair of lungs, Isaac got dealt a shitty pair of eyes, and Gus got dealt a shitty leg, had an uncontrollable relapse, and found out that everything else was shitty too. Side character Caitlin doesn't have anything wrong with her except for the fact that she is stupid, annoying, and totally irrelevant, but those negative qualities can also be attributed to her stars as well. After all, she didn't choose to be an irritating, shallow bitch with a head full of nitrogen. That's how she was written by the author. Hazel Grace especially seems to embody the nature of the title the most out of the whole cast, at least from a narrative perspective. Gus is the one who takes the lead in the relationship, puts the most effort into the relationship, and then his cancer is the thing that ends the relationship. A lot of the time, the interesting stuff that happens between them happens on Gus's end, and he has to call Hazel to get her to come over and involve herself in whatever he's planned. And I know that he's an independent decision-making agent in and of himself, something which he's eager to vocalize to his mother, but if you look at the story from Hazel's point of view, which we are because Hazel is the narrator, Gus's entrance into, existence in, and departure from Hazel's life is completely out of her control. Is this necessarily a bad thing? Not really. I reckon it's actually quite fitting for a book with this title. I mean, if you want to look at the book as mainly being the story of Hazel as framed by a reframing of a quote from Shakespeare, then the story is all about how we aren't really in control of our destinies. You might counter with the quote of Augustus, "You don't choose if you get hurt in this world, but you do have some say in who hurts you." But I would counter by saying that the character Isaac brings up the topic of true love, which is a theme that I assume runs thick through the relationship between Hazel and Gus, because Isaac's definition of true love, you stay with each other no matter what, is exactly what Hazel and Gus end up doing. True love, without a proper full redefinition of the term, implies some level of destiny or deeper meaning, or if you want to remain true to this novel's symbolism, stars. So I'd posit that Hazel falling in love with Augustus in the first place was determined by her stars. Correct me if I'm wrong, because I am actually wrong quite often, but aside from this final quote, I don't think it's ever implied in the novel that Hazel chose to fall in love with Augustus, or vice versa. It just seems to happen, regardless of whether either of them want it to or not. And when you consider that Hazel's love for Augustus is the primary motivator for most of the decisions she actually makes in this novel, she doesn't seem to have much agency in her own story. Which is fine. In fact, it's better than fine. It's brilliant. It means that this novel's subtext and themes come together as a nice, singular, cohesive bundle. But what is John Green actually saying here? Well, I don't think that this book presents a case for determinism. If it did, I'd vehemently disagree with it. And it's certainly not arguing against free will or personal responsibility, but it does attempt to make a case that our agency over ourselves is at the very least allowed or not allowed to us by the proverbial hand of fate. I mean, cancer is something that seriously restricts the life choices a person can make, but nobody chooses to develop cancer. The same goes for love, amongst other things. Do we choose who we fall in love with, or what we want to do with our lives? And if these things are what motivate us to take action, then how much control do we actually have over our lives? What are you looking at me for? I don't have an answer. Take a philosophy class or something. Let's talk about John Green's writing style for a moment. Much like his obvious inspiration, J.D. Salinger, John Green opts to use his protagonist's actual mode of speech as the narrative voice. This means that he's written the novel as though it were being told by a teenager. Now, I can speak from experience on this. Most 16 and 17-year-olds don't exactly talk like Oscar Wilde. So Green's writing style across all of his novels does contain some terms of phrase and colloquialisms which come across as either awkward or juvenile. But these awkward and juvenile turns of phrase are intentional because it's not supposed to be coming from John Green, it's supposed to be coming from Hazel Grace. And Hazel Grace isn't as well-read, well-educated, or well-written as John Green is. For a more extreme example, pick up Will Grayson, which was a collaboration between Green and some other dude named David Levithan. I haven't read any other books by Levithan, so I have no idea what his usual writing style is like, but his chosen writing style for Will Grayson made me want to vomit. Except the horridness of his writing style was intentional because he was writing from the point of view of a boy with severe clinical depression. The reader was meant to feel like they're actually being talked to by a person suffering this kind of psychological affliction, so being frustrated and disgusted with the writing style is actually the reflect Levithan was going for. John Green, meanwhile, isn't trying to portray J.D. Salinger's rebel without a cause or Levithan's clinically depressed gay kid. He's trying to portray ordinary, nerdy teenagers. So in most of his books, the writing style jumps between the banal ramblings of an ordinary teenager dealing with ordinary teenager problems and the profound philosophical thoughts of a very well-read teenager dealing with mature intellectual problems in an otherwise teenagery sort of way. Don't bother pointing out to me the great irony of this statement because I can see it fully well, but I don't think that this writing style works for me on its own. I think it needs a narrative or subtextual justification. For example, I gave Looking for Alaska credit for the fact that the writing style seemed to mature much more in the second half of the novel to illustrate that narrator Pudge was growing as an individual through his ordeals. And I reckon that the supposed ordinariness of Hazel Grace's narration can also be justified as an attempt to illustrate that Hazel is still an ordinary teenager who has the same thoughts and feelings as the rest of us ordinary teenagers despite her looming demise. And I think it goes a long way to give Hazel some dignity and show the reader that it's dishonest and disrespectful to paint cancer patients like her as some kind of other. So yes, despite my disdain for John Green's writing style, it is still justified in this book. Halt the positivity train for the moment because I do actually have a couple of criticisms of this novel. My minor criticism is that Peter Van Houten is not interesting enough for me to elaborate on since he is really just a recalibration or reaffirmation of the already established themes. He's not out of place, but then again he doesn't do anything profound and him turning out to be a complete ass to Hazel could be seen from a mile away. But my major criticism of this novel is primary love interest Augustus Waters because... Hey, did you hear that? That was the sound of 24 nerdfighters going, "Aww." So the reason I really don't like Augustus as a character is that he just seems too good to be true. Forgetting the fact that every sentence he utters is a carefully crafted nuanced line from Shakespearean dialogue charming enough to send a shiver down the spine of an asexual, aromantic, jaded, cynical misanthrope, and the fact that he's described as impossibly handsome but has both a prosthetic leg and a deceased ex-girlfriend to add to the scarred factor, His first date with Hazel involves him using his wit and cunning to find a way to get her all the way to bloody Amsterdam at no cost to her family for a romantic dinner and champagne under a starlit sky while fucking flower petals fall all around them. Which wouldn't necessarily be an issue in another novel except for 2 points. One, John Green is otherwise trying to portray the realistic struggle of a 16-year-old girl having to cope with falling in love while dying of cancer, so the impossibly perfect boyfriend seems out of place. And 2, Augustus isn't some suave mid to late 20s playboy who's been around and has mastered the art of charming girls. He's a middle-class 17-year-old who's only been in one previous relationship with a terminally ill girl whom he described as a total bitch. I really would have preferred it if Augustus were just some nerdy, dorky kid who hadn't a clue what he was doing, and yes, I'm still eating those words, thank you, but hear me out on this. I feel that the goal of the character study in this text was trying to resolve the dissonance between the profoundness of death and the ordinariness of falling in love at 16. John Green has the first half of that previous clause nailed perfectly, but the second half is needing to struggle under the weight of Augustus's massive, turgid perfection. On that note, having Hazel explicitly describe Augustus as not perfect in dialogue doesn't make it any less true, John. This isn't helped, obviously, by the fact that Gus pulls an Alaska 2/3 of the way through the novel. The last third or so is dedicated to Gus being this weak, pathetic thing slowly dying away in the care of Hazel and the rest of the cast, which again wouldn't ordinarily be out of place, but Gus is still romanticized to this absurd degree that I wondered to myself if his character hadn't just leapt from the perfect boyfriend fantasy to the dying lover fantasy. And before any of you nerd fighters comment that I liked Alaska Young and she was exactly like this, an absurd teenage fantasy character in an otherwise supposedly heartfelt story about the struggles of ordinary teenagers, good point. I mean, yeah, Alaska was kind of a schoolboy fantasy, much like Gus is a schoolgirl fantasy, if you'll forgive the incredibly gendered nature of my terminology. So why can I accept Alaska but I can't accept Gus? Don't say it's because I have a Y chromosome, because I'm bisexual. Gus counts as my schoolgirl fantasy too. I think it's because John Green's books are ordinarily kinda surreal by default. The novels may be leagues more unique and intelligent than the majority of the genre they belong to, but they ultimately aren't here to subvert the genre because they still fully embrace the anarchic stupidity that is high school drama. Looking for Alaska features a male stripper who performs in front of the school. Paper Towns features an impromptu road trip with 2 naked boys covered by graduation robes. And An Abundance of Catherines features a main character of 17 years of age who's been in 19 relationships with 19 different women, all named Catherine. Hence the title, if you didn't immediately figure that out. Meanwhile, The Fault in Our Stars is a more sombre tale that deals with much heavier themes. Hazel Grace isn't anarchic, not by a long shot. And she spends a lot of time having to deal with the banality of her short existence. Oh look, there's that phrase again. Put simply, she's a far cry from Miles Pudge, got sunk in the lake, then ran around the school setting off fireworks Halter as a protagonist. Unlike John Green's other entries, The Fault in Our Stars isn't surreal or over the top at all, except for Augustus Waters. The anarchic nature of Looking for Alaska makes the character of Alaska fit well within the tone of the story. But The Fault in Our Stars doesn't have the appropriate narrative framing to support a character like Augustus, and it's not that any one thing he does is completely absurd. So he finds a way to get Hazel Grace to Amsterdam. I can get behind that. But the amalgamation of his whole character is otherwise ill-fitting of a story like this. You know what, stick him in Paper Towns, he'd fit in perfectly there. It occurs to me that I may have the wrong expectations for this novel. Maybe John Green isn't trying to write anything profound and he just wants to tell a humble romance story starring cancer kids in order to give them greater representation in the media. So maybe having Augustus be this absurd perfect boyfriend is in service of providing a romance fantasy specifically for cancer kids, themes and broad insight be damned. And, well, that's good, I'm totally in support of that, but is there not some way it can be done without hurting the tone or the themes central to Hazel's character arc? The Fault in Our Stars already has this kind of subversive quality to it with the subtext that I previously mentioned, so I don't see why we couldn't have had a deviation from contrived romance tropes as well. Regardless of what the trailer to the upcoming movie adaptation might make you think, this story isn't subverting sugar-coated happily ever after romance fantasies. You don't subvert a genre just by providing an alternative that proposes a different thematic framing device for the narrative or whatever. Regardless of what criticisms I may give it, The Fault in Our Stars is still one of John Green's best, right up there with Looking for Alaska. It's still definitely within John Green's ballpark in terms of genre fiction, but it deviates from his usual formulaic nature enough that I was genuinely impressed. I wouldn't say it's entirely successful, but then again, I'm a soulless monster with a heart made of coal, and the feels don't seem to be working on me in this case. So maybe I'm just wrong.
Goes up. That would have too much fun.
Oh!
That would have too much fun. Sam, move along. Hey. Hello. 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 It's definitely